Braden Ombo. Been experimenting with block training, but with no set amount of weeks for each given block, kind of auto-regulating it. Is this a viable method since I'm maximizing each goal I have within each block until progress slows down? Absolutely. I think sometimes you preemptively, want to deload. I think we were talking about this a while back. It's like neither of us can really think of times where we've had, more than 3 or 4 weeks where we're just absolutely killing it at, progression. And so I like to, for the average person, like every 4th week, 4th or 5th week, maybe have a planned deload. But if you're in the middle of a volume block, and if you're talking about powerlifting and you actually are using block periodization to peak for a meet, you're going to want to have your volume phases, the annual plan be greater than your intensity blocks anyway. Because those intensity blocks have, handling heavy loads, and obviously once you start tapering for the meet, those can really, the overreaching intensity phases can definitely run you into the ground if you do them too long. But it sounds like you're kind of going with the approach, like if it's not broken, why fix it? And I think that's perfect.
It's actually refreshing to hear that nowadays.
Yeah. Let's see. Eduardo Jamie's. What are the pros and cons of creating a larger deficit from these two options? Adding cardio or decreasing calorie intake? When would either or be more beneficial and why?
So let's just assume this person is not contest prepping, because I think they're most likely not. Just standard fat loss.
Yeah. I think the first thing I look at is what's your schedule. When can you want to cater the strategy and the intervention around their behavior first and foremost. Somebody that, like myself right now, that, I have a new child, I have a baby, and my wife and I are very busy. I'm not going to be trying to create my deficit from cardio. And I think that's kind of the first thing I look at more than anything, more than the behavioral side trumps the physiological variabilities and flux. But what do you want to add to that?
I think you start there, and I think for general fat loss there's some wiggle room there. So would you rather eat less or would you rather move more? I think one thing is for sure, I don't think it should come from weight training, because that's something that people they'll do that sometimes. They'll just tack on more volume to their weight training, and it's an inappropriate amount. Like now you're misusing the tool that is weight training, And again, you're under eating still. There's still a deficit there. You're adding more volume. So I would say, first of all, let's not use weight training in that way. And if you are going to do it, if you have the time for it, I think fine. I think for some people it lets them stick to it a bit more. I would find it to be a pain, but that's just me. Some people would rather eat less, and then I even go through my phases too, where it's like, rather do a little extra cardio and get to eat a bit more. So there is some flexibility, I think. I think the main benefit before anything that might be happening on the inside is probably what helps you stick to your plan. So adherence.
Yeah. If you have a very active job too, what are you doing throughout the day? If you're working in construction and weight training, chances are you could probably get away with just doing a lot of diet. It's if your non-exercise expenditure is through the roof, then that's something to consider as well.
So I think with fat loss, just whatever helps you stick to it. I think that's priority number one.
Yeah, and I think it kind of to touch on the contest prep side of it too. I think once you get to a point, you don't want to keep cutting calories. Just from a mental standpoint, and 2, just fueling your training. And it also depends on the size of the individual. If you have a smaller female, you don't want to take them lower than you need to, so they might be doing a bit more cardio to create that deficit, whereas someone that's 240 pounds might not be doing quite as much, just because their total daily energy expenditure is a lot higher to begin with. So, what's Seamus cardio
Enzima does, I think, pretty moderate levels. Somewhere off the top of my head, something that would translate to maybe 4 or 5 sessions. And Enzima's a really big dude, and really big dude, just him at rest.
Yeah.
It's like 2 figure chicks just there. That's insane.
Let's see. We'll address this one. Is it actually unhealthy to stay ripped year round like people seem to say? How unhealthy actually is it? I think it's just a quality of life thing.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think you'll survive, but when you start, I mean, if a female just loses their menstrual cycle, it's like, okay, that's a sign that you're below your set point, and once you're done with whatever you're doing, should you choose to move forward in terms of competing and everything, get out of it. Like, get back to healthy body fat levels where you can function from a standpoint of reproducing. I mean, it's like
that's usually a big sign.
Yeah. So if your body is basically telling you like, we're not going to let you reproduce. Like, if you're a guy and you have zero libido, I mean, that's when it's starting to kind of, I think, adversely affect you in more ways than one. And so, I mean, I don't.
I'd say it's very, like, what is ripped is going to vary from person to person.
Yeah.
And a great example of this is, like, if you were to see just let's just say a football team, for example. All these athletes don't really care about body comp. They're just kind of floating around their set point, and you're going to see like this huge variety from person to person.
Mm-hmm.
Marshall Faulk, one of the best running backs in the league, which is not a fat guy position for those of you guys like overseas. Just like he had like boobs like down here in the gut, but that's where he performs well there.
Hung out.
So I think whatever lets you perform, and I do think that one thing I like to tell folks, especially when it comes to the whole body image thing, is I've made the best progress when I've just approached like my weight training like nobody's looking.
Yeah.
And that goes to like the weights I'm lifting for that set, like, because all that hot chicks look at me, I'm going to kick out like dumbbells that are way too heavy for me, or I want to look a certain way because otherwise, like, I'm fat and ugly, no one likes me. Do it like no one's looking to do it for you, and I think you will get
just pretend you're married.
There you go. There you go.
That's how I make good
Just
progress.
get married.
Just get married. Let's see. Opinion on constantly tracking volume on all movements, both compound and accessory. Is it necessary to be writing down sets, reps, weight on stuff like bicep curls? And is it imperative to follow a structured program for the accessory work? Or just the main lifts? Assuming strength is the biggest priority. Well, if the last part, if strength is the biggest priority, there's probably not really a need to be tracking, sets and reps on bicep curls. But I think, like, for me, it's sort of, like, I'll know sort of a direction that my accessory movements are going, but I'm not going to think, like, I got, 300 pounds of tonnage on bicep curls, and I'm going to, like, bump it up to 320 and, do half more rep. So it's, as long as you're just over time doing more work, that's like, you kind of know, like, it's one of those things. And a lot of bodybuilders that don't track it, it's like people have gotten into this mindset, like, I need to track everything in order to make progress. And it's a tool, but rely on your experience a little bit. I mean, some of the best natural bodybuilders in the world, I know don't track their volume, and it's like they just go in and they work their ass off. Could there be more like fine-tuned ways to do it? Yeah, maybe. You can't argue with results though, and so if they're getting results and they're not having to go through the headache of calculating out their volume, then I think it comes down to sort of behavior. Like, for me personally, like the heavy compound lifts, I do like to track where my sort of average intensity is, throughout a mesocycle, and relative volume and everything like that. And that just helps me sort of plan the next block. if I didn't have that information, I'd probably still be able to use some intuition and know, okay, this is heavier than the last walk, you know. And so it's a tool. I know some people, I don't want to say take it overboard, because for them that's sort of like mentally what gets them to adhere. But I think for things like curls, like it's like have a protocol, but that's one of those things where just, you know, an extra few reps here and there, or an increased frequency will go a long way.
When we think about it, the rate of progression is so different between a curl and a squat. I mean, you go from 20 pounds on the curl to 25, you just up
that's a lot.
25%.
And that's why you know, things like, you know, micro loading. This is a good plug for John
Barbell
Bossy, Barbell One. I mean, things like, you know, a lot of you know, like a lot of women that are sort of in that, you know, or men, women or men that are in that sort of the 120 to 150 pound bench press range. It's like those are your best friend, or any exercise where you're in that range, because, you know, a 5 pound increase is substantial. And that's not the same for somebody that's benching like in the mid 300s. And so use that, like if you use those, you know, the micro loading or the fractional plates, it does help to sort of know where you were prior to that. But it's,
I mean, honestly, I remember with my curls, like,
it's,
the way I used to have like these dumbbells at home, because when I first all I did was curl, and I think they were 15s. Wow, that was so bad. And I started with like sets of 10 in each arm, and then I just kept doing those until I got to like sets of 25, and I could get some new weights. But yeah, it was a super slow process, even back then, you know, compared to the big compound. So just, I would say, try to be progressive with that. You don't necessarily have to track it.
Yeah, I mean, you don't need to track to do anything. That goes for weight loss too. Like, you don't need to, just because you're not tracking your macros doesn't mean you don't know how to lose weight. I mean, so, I mean, can it fine tune things, especially on the nutrition front? Absolutely. Can it make things more optimal? Probably, but it's not a cut and dry answer.
I love it. We're just telling people
just wing it.
Let me make sure it's good. We'll do one or two more.
Yeah.
How's it going? Still going. Awesome. All right.
Can you elaborate more on the phrase "you have nowhere to progress"? Example, in setting a calorie deficit or choosing volume in training. I mean, this one is, in terms of a calorie deficit, usually you have some way to increase that deficit. It might not be reflected on the scale immediately. In terms of volume,
but you can lose weight until you die.
You can.
Yeah.
I mean, like the Minnesota experience.
Yeah, they kept going. They only stopped that because they were getting some. So the Minnesota semi-starvation experiment, for those of you who don't know, you know, they basically put these soldiers on something that was very similar to contest prep diets. The calories were about 50% of what they required. They were actually doing a lot of physical activity. It was a low protein diet, but anyhow, that might have caused some of the edema that they did get, but they were unable to track weight loss at a certain point, but they were still losing fat.
They're still losing body.
So, yeah. So again, there's always somewhere to go, at least with the diet.
With the dieting front, and I think with the training front, it's more like you might reach your limit for work capacity. You need to sort of extend that your ability, you know, from what you can get positive adaptations from, and usually what that requires is more submaximal volume over time, and so you can sort of build that work capacity up, and also just cardiovascular health, just being able to recover between sets. Like if you're dying, you know, after a 3-rep set of squats and you're resting for 15-20 minutes, you're not going to be able to accumulate much volume, and like your work capacity could be a limiting factor there, and it's probably just because you're out of shape. And so, I mean, it's like that'll go a long way. Like cardio's not the demon in that case. So, Do you have anything else to add on that?
I think sometimes you think you're plateauing, and then you can just,
Mhm.
you know, it might just take longer now. Like maybe sometimes it just happens like someone was used to progressing week to week, and they're like,
Yeah.
it takes me 2-3 weeks now, and like let's add more, which I think at that point is fine. But like for example, I've ran a very similar block over the last 3 mesocycles, and if anything, I've been cutting down volume to see how much I can get away with.
Yeah.
Just in case I might have been doing more than I needed to do. So that's always an option. Like,
Yeah.
let's take some off. Maybe we were doing more to the point where we were affecting, you know, our ability to recover.
Yeah, and that's a good point. Is I think when you get to the point where you're doing so much work and you're like, you know, I'm not progressing and I'm doing tons of volume, and you know, I know volume's super important. Like realize that you're bringing fatigue up with it, and so if you sometimes all it takes is just scaling back your training, bringing, you know, fatigue is going to drop quicker than you know, accrued fitness, and so you should see if you take a break or cut your volume, you should be able to bring fatigue down and see if that's the case. Like, oh, maybe I was you know charging forward a little too fast, and that's what's masking your progress. And so there's times where you can actually keep pushing and make things worse. When you just, it's kind of a nice feeling when you see, you know, like, oh, I can step back and get better progress, or at least bring down fatigue to a more manageable state, session to session. And, so, yeah, work capacity from a fat loss standpoint, you can pretty much keep going.
You can keep going. It just might not always be the best thing to do.
It might not be the healthiest
And
thing.
then when it comes to just training volume, I think sometimes like first thing we want to do is add. Sometimes stepping back a little is the answer.
Yeah, exactly.